I never thought I'd be shoved into my own pool by my son, just because I didn't grill the barbecue. My whole family burst out laughing. The next morning, he said, "My father-in-law is coming for lunch. Cut the grass and clean the house." I stayed silent. Then, the surprise came when he tried to enter and saw the locks had already changed. Before we continue, I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. At 63 years old, I never imagined I'd find myself sprawled in my own swimming pool, fully clothed, while my entire family erupted in laughter above me. The chlorinated water burned my eyes as I struggled to surface, my Sunday clothes clinging to my aging body like a second skin. But the real sting wasn't from the pool chemicals. It was from the realization that my own son had just pushed me in like I was some kind of joke. "Come on, Dad, it's just a barbecue," Glenn had said moments before, his voice dripping with that condescending tone I'd grown too familiar with over the past few years. "Just throw some burgers on the grill. How hard can it be?" I had been sitting peacefully on my patio chair, enjoying the rare moment of quiet before the family gathering. My arthritis had been acting up all week, and the thought of standing over a hot grill for 2 hours, while everyone else relaxed, seemed unbearable. "I'm tired, Glenn. Maybe someone else could handle the cooking today." That's when it happened. One moment I was explaining my aching joints. The next I felt Glenn's hands on my shoulders, shoving me backward into the deep end. The splash was enormous, sending waves across the pool deck and soaking the nearby lounge chairs. As I broke the surface, gasping and disoriented, the sound hit me like a physical blow. Laughter. Not just chuckles or nervous giggles, but full-belly unrestrained laughter. Glenn was doubled over, slapping his knee, like he just witnessed the funniest thing in the world. His wife Sarah had her phone out, probably recording my humiliation for her social media friends. Even my own grandchildren were pointing and giggling, their young faces lit up with cruel amusement. "Oh my God, Grandpa looks like a drowned rat," my 12-year-old granddaughter squealed, causing another round of hysterics from the crowd. I paddled toward the pool's edge, my waterlogged shoes making every movement a struggle. The concrete scraped against my palms as I hauled myself out, water streaming from my clothes and pooling around my feet. My glasses had fallen off during the fall, leaving the world slightly blurred, but I could see clearly enough to witness the entertainment I'd provided for my family. "Glenn, that was too much," Sarah said, but she was still giggling as she spoke. "Look at him, he's soaked." "He'll dry off," Glenn replied with a shrug, already turning away from me toward the grill. "Besides, maybe now he'll remember. Who's supposed to be cooking around here?" I stood there dripping, my polo shirt transparent, and my khaki pants clinging uncomfortably to my legs. Nobody offered me a towel. Nobody asked if I was hurt. Nobody seemed to care that their father and grandfather had just been treated like a disobedient child who needed to be taught a lesson. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the public humiliation. It was the sudden crushing realization of how far I had fallen in my own family's estimation. When had I become the family joke? When had my son decided that pushing his aging father into a pool was an appropriate way to handle a simple disagreement? As I squelched across the deck toward the house, leaving wet footprints in my wake, I could hear Glenn already taking charge of the barbecue situation. "All right, everyone, crisis averted. The old man will change clothes, and we'll get this party started properly." The old man. That's what I'd become to them. Not Dad, not Grandpa, not Russell. Just the old man who lived in their house, and occasionally inconvenienced them with his presence. I made my way upstairs to my bedroom, peeling off my wet clothes with trembling hands. Whether the trembling was from the cold water or something deeper, I couldn't say. In the bathroom mirror, I caught sight of myself, hair plastered to my skull, face flushed from embarrassment and exertion, looking every bit the fool they'd made me out to be. 43 years I'd lived in this house. 43 years of memories of raising Glenn from a baby to a man, of thinking I was building something meaningful. My late wife Margaret and I had dreamed of growing old here, surrounded by family who loved and respected us. Margaret had been gone for 8 years now, and in her absence I'd somehow transformed from the head of the household into its most expendable member. As I changed into dry clothes, I could hear the party continuing below. The laughter had died down, replaced by normal conversation and the sizzle of meat on the grill. Life had moved on, as if my humiliation was just a brief intermission in their entertainment. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my wet clothes crumpled on the bathroom floor. The man who had built this house with his own hands, who had worked 60-hour weeks to provide for his family, who had changed diapers and attended school plays, and taught his son to drive. That man had just been pushed into a pool for refusing to cook hamburgers. Something had shifted in that moment underwater. As I'd struggled to surface, gasping for air and dignity, I'd felt something inside me change. The docile, accommodating father who had spent the last few years trying not to be a burden, had drowned in that pool. What climbed out was someone different, someone who was starting to remember what self-respect felt like. Downstairs, I could hear Glenn holding court, probably telling everyone about his brilliant solution to the barbecue problem. The sound of their voices, so casual and dismissive, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. The pool incident happened on a Sunday. By Tuesday morning, I thought maybe Glenn would say something, an apology perhaps, or at least an acknowledgement that he'd gone too far. Instead, I woke up to find him standing in my kitchen at 7 o'clock in the morning, coffee mug in hand, acting like nothing had happened. "Morning, Dad," he said without looking up from his phone. "Sarah's father is coming for lunch today. Make sure the house is spotless. And I need you to cut the grass before he gets here." I blinked, still groggy from sleep, trying to process what I was hearing. "What time is lunch?" "Noon. So you've got about 5 hours. Should be plenty of time if you get moving now." He scrolled through his phone with the casual air of someone giving instructions to hired help. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands steadier than they'd been in days. "Maybe you could help with some of it." "I'm not as young as I used to be." Glenn finally looked up, his expression shifting to that familiar mix of impatience and irritation that had become his default whenever I spoke. "Dad, this is important. Sarah's father is considering investing in my business. I need everything to be perfect. And frankly, you're better at the yard work than I am. It's not like you have anything else to do." The dismissal in his voice was so casual, so absolute that it took my breath away. Not like I had anything else to do, as if my entire existence revolved around being available for his convenience. "The grass is fine, Glenn. I cut it last week." "It's not fine. It's too long and there are weeds near the fence." "Look, this isn't negotiable. Sarah's dad is old school. He judges people by how they maintain their property. First impressions matter." I studied my son's face, searching for any trace of the boy I'd raised. The one who used to help me with yard work on Saturday mornings. That boy was gone, replaced by this stranger who spoke to me, like I was an inconvenience he was forced to tolerate. "What about the inside of the house?" "Sarah will handle most of it, but I need you to clean the bathrooms and vacuum the living areas. Oh, and make sure the garage is organized. You might want to see my workshop setup." The list kept growing, each task delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. I found myself nodding along, falling back into the pattern of submission that had somehow become my default over the past few years. When had I stopped being Glenn's father and become his employee? By 8:30, I was outside with the lawnmower, the morning sun already promising another scorching day. My arthritis protested every step, but I pushed through it, telling myself it was just one day, just a few hours of work. The grass really wasn't that long, but I cut it anyway, trimming edges that didn't need trimming, pulling weeds that were barely visible. As I worked, I could see Glenn and Sarah through the kitchen window, discussing their preparations. Sarah was animated, gesturing with her coffee cup, clearly excited about impressing her father. Glenn nodded along, occasionally checking his watch. Neither of them looked in my direction. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was my house, the house Margaret and I had saved for, planned for, built our life in. Yet here I was, scrambling to make it presentable, for someone else's approval, treated like the groundskeeper rather than the homeowner. By 10 o'clock, I'd moved inside to tackle the bathrooms. My back ached from the yard work, but there was no time to rest. I scrubbed toilets, mopped floors, and polished mirrors until they gleamed. The whole time I could hear Sarah and Glenn discussing the menu, the conversation topics they'd bring up, the impression they wanted to make. "Make sure he doesn't go on one of his old war stories," Sarah said as I passed by the kitchen. "Your dad has a way of dominating conversations." "Don't worry about it. I'll keep him busy in the garage if I have to." They were talking about me like I wasn't even there, planning to shuffle me out of sight, like an embarrassing piece of furniture. The realization hit me with surprising force. They weren't just treating me as help. They were treating me as a liability. I finished the bathrooms and moved on to vacuuming, the machine's noise drowning out their conversation, but not my thoughts. Each room I cleaned felt like another piece of my dignity being erased. This was my home, filled with my furniture, my memories, my life. Yet I was cleaning it for the approval of a stranger, while my own family planned to hide me away. At 11:15, Glenn found me organizing the garage, sorting through tools I'd accumulated over decades of home ownership. "How's it coming, Dad?" "Almost done," I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Good. When Sarah's father gets here, just try to keep the conversation light, okay? Nothing too heavy or personal. And maybe don't mention your health issues. It makes people uncomfortable." I turned to face him fully, studying this man who shared my DNA, but seemed to have inherited none of my values. "You want me to pretend I'm someone I'm not?" "I want you to be presentable." "Is that too much to ask?" The word presentable hung in the air between us like a slap. Not welcome, not valued, not loved. Just presentable. like a piece of property that needed to pass inspection. "No," I said quietly. "It's not too much to ask." Glenn smiled. The first genuine expression of approval I'd seen from him in months. "Great, he should be here any minute. You might want to wash up and change shirts. You've got grass stains." As he walked away, I looked down at my clothes, at the evidence of my morning's labor. The old Russell would have hurried inside to clean up, would have made himself presentable for a guest he'd never met, would have smiled and played along, with whatever version of himself his family required. But something was different now. Standing in my own garage, surrounded by my own tools, in the house I'd worked my entire life to afford, I felt a spark of something I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't anger exactly, though that was part of it. It was clarity. For the first time in a long time, I could see the situation exactly as it was, without the fog of family obligation and misplaced loyalty. I was 63 years old, and I was being treated like the hired help in my own home. The son I'd raised and provided for was embarrassed by my existence. The daughter-in-law I'd welcomed into my family saw me as an obstacle to overcome. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted my thoughts. Sarah's father had arrived, and showtime was about to begin. The lunch with Sarah's father went exactly as Glenn had orchestrated. I played my part perfectly. The quiet, unobtrusive older man who smiled at the right moments and excused himself when the business talk began. Mr. Hartwell seemed pleasant enough, a successful businessman in his 70s who spoke about investments and market opportunities with the confidence of someone who'd made good money over the years. I spent most of the meal listening to Glenn pitch his consulting business, watching my son transform into the charming, ambitious entrepreneur he became whenever money was involved. Sarah played the supportive wife flawlessly, chiming in with carefully rehearsed anecdotes about Glenn's work ethic and vision. When Mr. Hartwell complimented the house and asked about the beautiful garden, Glenn accepted the praise as if he'd personally planted every flower. When the conversation turned to family values and the importance of tradition, Glenn spoke eloquently about building something lasting for future generations. I sat there invisible at my own dining table, listening to my son take credit for a life I'd built. After lunch, I retreated to my bedroom for what I told them was a nap. In reality, I just needed to escape the suffocating performance downstairs. I could hear their voices drifting up through the floorboards, animated discussions about investment terms and partnership possibilities. Glenn's laughter carried a note of triumph that made my stomach turn. Around 4 o'clock, I heard Mr. Hartwell's car pull away. The house fell quiet, except for the murmur of Glenn and Sarah's voices in the kitchen. I assumed they were debriefing about the meeting, probably celebrating what sounded like a successful pitch. I must have actually dozed off, because the next thing I knew, it was nearly 6 in the evening. The house was unusually quiet. I made my way downstairs, expecting to find Glenn and Sarah, discussing their afternoon triumph, but the main floor was empty. Their cars were gone from the driveway. It struck me as odd that they'd left without saying anything, but I'd grown accustomed to being an afterthought in their daily routines. I made myself a simple dinner and settled in front of the television, trying not to think about how lonely the house felt, without Margaret's presence to fill the silence. The evening passed uneventfully. I watched the news, read a few chapters of a book I'd been working through, and eventually headed to bed around 10 o'clock. Glenn and Sarah still weren't home, which wasn't entirely unusual. They often went out for dinner or drinks after business meetings. The next morning, I woke to the sound of voices in the driveway. Through my bedroom window, I could see Glenn and Sarah unloading suitcases from their car. It looked like they'd spent the night somewhere, probably celebrating their successful meeting with Mr. Hartwell. I took my time getting dressed, my joints protesting the previous day's physical labor. By the time I made it downstairs, they were in the kitchen, coffee already brewed, looking refreshed and energetic. "Good morning," I said, pouring myself a cup. "How did the rest of yesterday go?" "Fantastic," Glenn replied without looking up from his phone. "Mr. Hartwell is very interested in moving forward. We spent the evening working out preliminary details." "That's wonderful. I'm happy for you." Sarah glanced at Glenn, some silent communication passing between them. "Actually, Russell, we need to talk to you about something." The use of my first name instead of Dad sent an immediate chill through me. Sarah never called me Russell, unless something was wrong. "We've been thinking," Glenn began, setting down his phone with deliberate care. "This arrangement isn't working anymore." I felt my coffee cup grow heavy in my hands. "What arrangement?" "You living here with us." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing the weather. "It made sense when you first moved in after Mom died, but we're at a different stage now. Sarah and I need our space, especially with the business expanding." The words hit me like a physical blow. I set my coffee cup down carefully, afraid my trembling hands might drop it. "This is my house, Glenn." "Technically, yes, but practically speaking, Sarah and I have been running the household for years. We pay the utilities, handle the maintenance, manage everything. You've basically been a tenant in the house I'd owned for 43 years, in the house where I changed his diapers, taught him to ride a bike, and helped him with homework, at the very kitchen table where he was now evicting me. Where am I supposed to go? Sarah leaned forward, her expression what she probably thought was sympathetic. There are some really nice senior communities in the area, places where you'd have people your own age, activities, medical care if you need it. It might actually be better for you. I don't want to live in a senior community. I want to live in my home. Glenn's jaw tightened. Dad, be realistic. You're getting older. Your health isn't great and you're isolated here. At least in a community setting, you'd have support. I have support. I have family. The silence that followed was deafening. Glenn and Sarah exchanged another look, and I realized with dawning horror that they'd already made this decision. This wasn't a discussion. It was a notification. We've already looked into a few places, Sarah said gently. There's a really nice facility about 20 minutes away. They have an opening in their assisted living wing. I don't need assisted living. I can take care of myself just fine. Can you? Glenn's voice had taken on that condescending tone again. Dad, you couldn't even handle cooking hamburgers last Sunday. Yesterday it took you all morning to clean the house for one guest. You're struggling and it's only going to get worse. The pool incident. They were using my humiliation against me, twisting it into evidence of my incompetence. The realization that they'd been planning this, even while I was working to make their meeting successful, made me feel physically sick. I need time to think about this. Of course, Glenn said. Take all the time you need, but we'd like to have this resolved within the next few weeks. Mr. Hartwell's investment comes with some conditions about upgrading the property, and we need to start planning renovations. Renovations. They were already planning to change my house, to erase any trace of the life Margaret and I had built here. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. I'm going to go for a walk. That's a good idea, Sarah said. Clear your head. When you come back, maybe we can look at some brochures together. I walked out of the kitchen without another word, grabbed my jacket from the hall closet, and headed for the front door. My hand was on the doorknob when I heard Glenn's voice behind me. Dad, take your time, but don't forget this is what's best for everyone. I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, my mind reeling. The neighborhood looked the same as always. Neat lawns, familiar houses, the tree-lined street where I'd walked countless times over the decades. But everything felt different now, like I was seeing it through the eyes of someone who no longer belonged. I walked for over an hour, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally returned to the house, Glenn and Sarah's cars were gone again. A note on the kitchen counter informed me they'd gone to look at renovation plans and would be back later. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. This room, where Margaret and I had slept for 35 years, where we'd planned our future and raised our son, was now just a temporary space I was occupying, until they could find somewhere else to put me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photos on the nightstand. Margaret's smile looked back at me from our wedding day, from Glenn's graduation, from countless holidays and anniversaries. What would she think if she could see what had become of the family she'd loved so much? The worst part wasn't even the eviction itself. It was the calculated nature of it all. The way they'd waited until after their business meeting. The way they'd presented it as concern for my welfare. The way they'd made it sound like I should be grateful for their thoughtfulness. I was 63 years old, and my own son was treating me like a problem to be solved, rather than a father to be loved. I spent the next 3 days in a strange sort of limbo. Glenn and Sarah went about their business with renewed energy, making phone calls about their potential investment, and discussing renovation plans in hushed tones that stopped whenever I entered a room. They treated me with the careful politeness you'd show an elderly relative you were trying to move into a nursing home. Kind but distant, patient but firmly resolved. On Thursday morning, I found myself alone in the house again. Glenn had left early for what he called investor meetings, and Sarah had gone to her part-time job at the boutique downtown. The silence felt different now, charged with the knowledge that my time here was limited. I wandered through the rooms like a ghost, seeing everything with new eyes. The living room where Glenn had taken his first steps, the kitchen where Margaret had taught him to bake cookies, the back patio, where we'd hosted countless birthday parties and barbecues. Soon all of this would be renovated, transformed into something that reflected Glenn and Sarah's taste, rather than the memories Margaret and I had created. It was while I was standing in my bedroom, looking at the stack of senior living brochures Sarah had left on my dresser, that I remembered the filing cabinet in the basement. Margaret had always been meticulous about keeping our important documents organized, and after she died, I'd simply locked the cabinet and tried not to think about the painful task of going through her papers. But now, facing the prospect of leaving everything behind, I realized I needed to know exactly what I owned and what rights I had. Maybe Glenn was right that I'd become dependent on them, but this was still my house, and I wanted to understand my legal position before I made any decisions. The basement was cool and slightly musty, filled with boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture, and the accumulated possessions of a 43-year marriage. The filing cabinet sat in the corner, its metal surface dusty from years of neglect. I'd avoided this corner of the basement since Margaret's death, but now I approached it with purpose. The key was where it had always been, taped to the bottom of the cabinet's top drawer. Inside, Margaret's careful organization was immediately apparent. File folders labeled in her neat handwriting. Insurance, medical, house documents, investments, Glenn's education. I pulled out the house documents first, expecting to find the deed and mortgage papers I remembered signing decades ago, but as I read through the documents, something didn't make sense. The house had been paid off 15 years ago, just as I remembered, but there were other papers I didn't recognize. A second mortgage taken out 8 years ago, just after Margaret died. My signature was on the documents, but I had no memory of signing them. The loan was for $50,000, with Glenn listed as the co-signer and primary beneficiary. My hands began to shake as I read through the terms. The monthly payments were being automatically deducted from my checking account. Payments I'd never noticed, because Glenn had convinced me to let him help manage my finances after Margaret's death. He'd said it was too much for me to handle while I was grieving, and I'd been grateful for his assistance. But this loan, this mortgage on my fully paid house, I'd never agreed to this. I would never have agreed to this. I dug deeper into the files, finding more documents that made my blood run cold. A home equity line of credit for $25,000, opened 6 years ago. Another loan for $30,000 secured against the house, from 3 years ago. All of them bore my signature, but I remembered none of them. How was this possible? How could I have signed these documents without remembering? Unless the answer hit me like a physical blow. The months after Margaret's death had been a blur of grief and depression. I'd been so lost, so overwhelmed by the practical matters of life without her, that I'd signed whatever Glenn put in front of me. He'd handled everything. The funeral arrangements, the insurance paperwork, the financial accounts. I'd trusted him completely, grateful to have someone take care of the details, while I struggled to function. He'd exploited my grief while I was mourning his mother. He'd been using my signature to borrow against my house. But there was more. Hidden behind the loan documents, I found a folder labeled Property Transfer. Inside was a quitclaim deed dated just 6 months ago, transferring ownership of the house from me to Glenn. My signature was there too, notarized and official. I stared at the document, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. According to this paper, I no longer owned my house. Glenn did. When had I signed this? Why didn't I remember? Then I remembered Sarah's father's visit, the investment opportunity they'd been so excited about. Glenn had mentioned that Mr. Hartwell's investment came with conditions about upgrading the property. Had Glenn needed to prove ownership to secure the deal? I rifled through more papers, finding bank statements for accounts I didn't recognize. Accounts in Glenn's name, funded by the loan secured against my house. The money had been used for everything except what the loan applications claimed. Instead of home improvements or emergency medical expenses, the funds had gone toward Glenn's business ventures, Sarah's shopping sprees, vacations I'd never taken. The total amount was staggering. Over $100,000 borrowed against my home, with me supposedly responsible for payments on loans I'd never knowingly signed. But the quit-claim deed was the final insult. Somehow Glenn had managed to get me to sign away ownership of my house. The house wasn't even mine anymore. Legally, I really was just a tenant, just as Glenn had claimed. I sat there in the basement, surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal, feeling like the foundations of my world had crumbled beneath me. Everything I'd thought I knew about my situation was wrong. I wasn't a father being gently encouraged to consider assisted living. I was a victim of financial abuse, being evicted from property I no longer legally owned. The clever part was how slowly and carefully Glenn had done it. No single document was so obviously fraudulent that it would raise immediate suspicions. Each loan had been spaced out over years, each signature obtained during moments when I was distracted, grieving, or simply trusting my son to handle matters I found overwhelming. But as I studied the signatures more closely, something began to bother me. They looked like my handwriting, but there were subtle differences. The way certain letters were formed, the pressure of the pen strokes. Some signatures looked rushed or unsteady, as if I'd been signing while distracted or upset. I pulled out my current driver's license and compared my signature on that to the ones on the loan documents. The differences were slight but noticeable. Either these signatures had been forged, or I'd signed them under circumstances I couldn't remember. Then I found something that made everything clear. Tucked behind the property transfer documents was a medical file I didn't recognize. Inside were prescriptions for medications I'd never heard of. Anxiety medications, sleep aids, drugs typically used to treat severe depression. The prescriptions were all filled during the months after Margaret's death, all signed by Dr. Morrison, Glenn's golf buddy. I'd never seen Dr. Morrison for depression. My regular doctor had prescribed some mild sleep aids during my grief, but nothing like these powerful medications. Yet, according to these records, I'd been taking doses of drugs that would have left me confused, disoriented, possibly even unconscious for periods of time. The picture was becoming horrifyingly clear. Glenn hadn't just exploited my grief. He'd drugged me. With the help of his doctor friend, he'd medicated me into a state where I could be manipulated, into signing away everything I owned. I thought back to those dark months after Margaret's funeral. There had been days when I'd felt so foggy and disoriented that I'd barely been able to function. I'd attributed it to grief, to the natural effects of losing my life partner. Glenn had been so helpful during that time, bringing me meals, checking on me, making sure I took my medications. I'd been grateful for his care, never suspecting that the pills he was giving me were designed to make me compliant and confused. The worst part was realizing how long this had been going on. The most recent loan was from just 6 months ago, long after my grief should have subsided. Glenn had continued to medicate and manipulate me, probably increasing the doses. Whenever he needed me to sign something important, I gathered all the documents and carried them upstairs, my mind racing. Glenn and Sarah were planning to force me into assisted living, not out of concern for my welfare, but because they needed me gone, before I discovered what they'd done. Once I was safely tucked away in a facility, probably heavily medicated for anxiety or depression, they'd have complete control over the property. They'd stolen from me, but they'd made one crucial mistake. By leaving me alone in the house today, they'd given me the opportunity to discover the truth. And now that I knew what they'd done, I had to decide what to do about it. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I could see Glenn's car pulling up. He was home earlier than expected, probably eager to continue pushing me toward their preferred solution. I quickly gathered the most damning documents and hid them in my bedroom, leaving the filing cabinet exactly as I'd found it. When Glenn walked through the front door, I was sitting calmly in the living room, the picture of a confused old man, contemplating his limited options. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness that had become his default tone with me. "How was your day? Did you have a chance to look at those brochures Sarah left for you?" I looked up at Glenn, with what I hoped was a tired smile. "I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe you're right about the assisted living place." The relief that washed over his face was almost comical. "Really, Dad? That's great. I know this is hard, but it's really for the best. I suppose I should start getting my affairs in order," I said carefully. "Make sure all my documents are updated, that kind of thing." "Don't worry about any of that," Glenn said quickly. "Sarah and I can handle all the paperwork. You just focus on getting ready for the transition." Of course, he didn't want me looking at paperwork. The last thing he needed was for me to discover what I'd already found. Over the next 2 days, I played the part of the resigned, defeated father. I let them show me brochures for Sunset Manor, the assisted living facility they'd chosen. I nodded when they explained how much better my life would be, with professional care and social activities. I even let Sarah take me for a tour of the place, where I smiled politely at the cheerful staff and admired the bland institutional decor. But while they were making their plans, I was making mine. The first call I made was to Margaret's nephew, David, a lawyer in the next county. David had always been fond of his aunt, and he'd helped us with our wills years ago. I waited until Glenn and Sarah were both out of the house before I called him. "Uncle Russell." David's voice carried genuine warmth. "How are you holding up?" "I need your help, David. Legal help, and I need you to keep this conversation confidential." The warmth in his voice shifted to professional concern. "What's going on?" I told him everything. The forced loans, the forged signatures, the medical records, the quitclaim deed. David listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Jesus, Russell, this is serious. If what you're telling me is accurate, we're talking about elder abuse, fraud, possibly forgery. Do you have copies of these documents?" "I have the originals. I found them in Margaret's filing cabinet." "Good. Don't let them know you found anything. Can you get copies to me without them knowing?" "I think so. They're both out of the house tomorrow morning." "Perfect. Bring everything to my office. We need to move fast on this." The next morning, I told Glenn and Sarah I was going to the bank to organize my accounts for the move to Sunset Manor. Glenn offered to drive me, but I insisted I could manage one last trip on my own. "Independence is important to me," I said, and he couldn't argue with that without seeming heartless. David's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of place that inspired confidence in its old-fashioned solidity. He'd cleared his morning schedule to see me, and his secretary brought us coffee. while we spread the documents across his conference table. "This is worse than I thought," David said after reviewing everything. "The pattern here suggests systematic financial abuse over several years. The timing of these loans corresponds with your wife's death, and your period of grief and these medical records." He shook his head. "This Dr. Morrison prescribed enough sedatives to keep you compliant for months. Can we prove it with the right investigation?" "Yes, but Russell, there's something else we need to discuss. Even if we can prove fraud, getting your property back is going to be complicated. Glenn has been making payments on these loans, and he's probably established a paper trail showing he's been the effective owner of the house for years." My heart sank. "So he gets to keep what he stole?" "Not necessarily. But we need to be strategic about this. If we go in guns blazing with criminal charges, Glenn will lawyer up, and the whole thing becomes a messy court battle. That could take years. Meanwhile, you're still living in his house at his sufferance. What do you suggest?" David leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "We set a trap. We let Glenn think he's getting exactly what he wants, and then we spring our evidence at the moment when it does the most damage." "I'm listening." "You go back home and tell them you've decided to move into Sunset Manor immediately. Be enthusiastic about it. Tell them you want to get the house ready for their renovations. They'll be so relieved that they'll probably start making their plans public. And then we wait for them to make a mistake. Glenn's got Mr. Hartwell's money coming in, right? He's probably planning to use that investment to pay off the loans he took against your house, which would give him clear title. When he tries to do that, we'll be ready with our evidence." I understood the strategy, but it meant continuing to live with them, continuing to pretend I didn't know what they'd done. "How long?" "Probably not more than a week or two. Glenn's going to want to move fast, now that he thinks you're cooperating. The key is making him overconfident." I spent the drive home rehearsing my performance. When I walked into the house, Glenn and Sarah were waiting in the living room, clearly anxious to hear how my banking trip had gone. "Well?" Sarah asked. I sat down heavily, putting on my most defeated expression. "I've been thinking about what you said, about this being for the best. I called Sunset Manor this morning. They have an opening next week." Glenn's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Dad, that's fantastic. I know this is hard, but you're making the right choice." "I want to do this right," I said. "Get everything organized, so you don't have to deal with any loose ends. Maybe we should have the house appraised. Get it ready for those renovations you mentioned." "That's very thoughtful," Sarah said. "But don't worry about any of that. We'll handle everything." "No, I insist. This house has been my life for 43 years. I want to see it properly prepared for its next chapter." Over the next few days, I played the role perfectly. I asked Sarah to help me pack my belongings. I requested that Glenn explain the renovation plan, so I could visualize how wonderful the house would look. I even suggested they invite Mr. Hartwell over for dinner, so I could thank him for giving Glenn such a wonderful opportunity. Glenn was practically glowing with triumph. He started making phone calls about contractors, talking openly about his plans to expand the master bedroom and convert my den into a home office. Sarah began shopping for new furniture, leaving catalogs open around the house to show me the improvements they were planning. But the most telling moment came when I overheard Glenn on the phone with his bank, discussing the timeline for clearing the property liens with his new investment capital. He was planning to pay off all the fraudulent loans the moment Mr. Hartwell's money came through, which would give him undisputed ownership of my house. "The old man is moving out next week," I heard him tell someone. "After that, we'll have a clear path forward." The old man, even in his moment of triumph, that's all I was to him. On Friday evening, Glenn announced that Mr. Hartwell was coming for dinner on Sunday to finalize their partnership agreement. "It'll be the perfect send-off for you, Dad. You can meet the man who's helping us secure our future." "I'm looking forward to it," I said, and I meant it. Saturday morning, I called David with an update. "It's happening tomorrow night. Glenn's planning to close the deal with his investor." "Perfect. I've got everything ready on this end." "Are you sure you want to do this?" "Once we play this card, there's no going back." I thought about Margaret, about the house we'd built together, about the son we'd raised to be better than this. "I'm sure." "All right, I'll be there at 7:30. Make sure Glenn and his investor are both present when I arrive." Sunday arrived gray and drizzly, but Glenn's mood was sunny. He spent the morning cleaning the house, with an energy I hadn't seen from him in years. Sarah prepared an elaborate dinner, setting the dining room table with Margaret's good china. They were pulling out all the stops for Mr. Hartwell. "This is it, Dad," Glenn said, as he adjusted the centerpiece for the third time. "After tonight, everything changes for the better." I nodded solemnly. "Yes, son, after tonight, everything changes." Mr. Hartwell arrived promptly at 6, bringing a bottle of expensive wine and the confident air of a man about to make a profitable deal. Glenn greeted him like a long-lost brother, and Sarah played the gracious hostess to perfection. I sat quietly through dinner, playing the role of the grateful father, witnessing his son's success. As we moved to the living room for coffee and brandy, Glenn pulled out a leather portfolio containing the investment documents. "Russell was just telling me how excited he is about our partnership," he said to Mr. Hartwell. "He's been like a mentor to me through this whole process." The irony was so thick I could taste it, but I just smiled and nodded. At exactly 7:30, the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," I said, standing slowly. "Probably just a neighbor." Glenn waved me off, clearly not wanting any interruptions during his big moment. "I'll handle it, Dad." But I was already at the door, opening it to reveal David in his best suit, briefcase in hand, wearing the serious expression of a man on official business. "Good evening, Russell," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Glenn's face went from confusion to alarm as David walked into the living room. "Dad, who is this? We're in the middle of an important meeting." "This is David Morrison," I said calmly. "Margaret's nephew. He's an attorney, and he's here to discuss some irregularities with the ownership of this property." The blood drained from Glenn's face. Sarah dropped her coffee cup, the porcelain shattering against the hardwood floor. Mr. Hartwell, sensing trouble, set down his brandy glass and straightened in his chair. "Russell," Glenn said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. Maybe we should discuss this privately." "No misunderstanding," David said, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick folder. "In fact, everything is quite clear, Mr. Hartwell. I assume you're here to finalize an investment with Glenn Holloway." "That's correct," Mr. Hartwell replied cautiously. "We're discussing a partnership in his consulting business, and I assume that partnership involves using this property as collateral or security for the investment." Glenn jumped to his feet. "Now wait just a minute. This is completely inappropriate. We have a private business meeting happening here." David smiled pleasantly. "Actually, it's quite appropriate, since the property you're using as security doesn't belong to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Hartwell's eyes moved from David to Glenn to me, clearly trying to understand what was happening. "Of course it belongs to me," Glenn said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I have the deed right here." He fumbled with his portfolio, pulling out the quitclaim deed I'd found in the basement. David examined the document briefly. "Ah, yes, this deed dated 6 months ago. Tell me, Glenn, do you remember the circumstances under which your father signed this?" He wanted to transfer the property to me for estate planning purposes." "Really? That's interesting. Because according to the medical records I have here, your father was taking substantial doses of lorazepam, alprazolam, and zolpidem at the time he supposedly signed this document. Medications prescribed by Dr. Frederick Morrison. No relation to me, by the way. Medications that would have rendered him incapable of understanding what he was signing." Sarah made a small choking sound. Glenn's face had gone from pale to gray. "Furthermore," David continued, "the signature on this document doesn't match your father's normal signature pattern. Neither do the signatures on the 3 separate loans, totaling over $100,000 that were supposedly signed by Russell over the past 8 years. Mr. Hartwell stood up abruptly. "I think I should leave. This sounds like a family matter that needs to be resolved privately." "Actually," David said, "you might want to stay. You see, any investment you make based on Glenn's ownership of this property would be invalid. The property belongs entirely to Russell Holloway, as it has for the past 43 years. Glenn has no legal right to use it as collateral for anything." "That's not true!" Glenn shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "Dad signed everything over to me. He agreed to it." I stood up slowly, feeling stronger than I had in years. "No, Glenn, I never agreed to any of it. You drugged me and forged my signature on documents I never saw. You stole my house while I was grieving your mother." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Glenn's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Sarah had gone completely white and was gripping the arm of her chair like she might fall over. Mr. Hartwell picked up his coat. "Glenn, I'm afraid this changes everything. I can't possibly move forward with an investment based on fraudulent collateral. You'll be hearing from my attorneys." "Wait," Glenn said desperately. "This is all a misunderstanding. We can work this out." But Mr. Hartwell was already heading for the door. "Good evening, Russell. I'm sorry you've had to endure this." After the front door closed behind him, the 3 of us stood in the living room facing each other. The weight of 8 years of deception hung between us like a storm cloud. "Dad," Glenn said, his voice breaking, "please let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you convinced Dr. Morrison to prescribe drugs that would make me compliant. How you forged my signature on loan documents. How you stole my house while pretending to care for me." David cleared his throat. "Russell, there's more. I had a forensic accountant review the bank records. Glenn didn't just steal your house. He's been systematically draining the equity for years. The money from those loans went toward his business ventures, luxury purchases, vacations. None of it went toward your care, or the property maintenance he claimed it was for. Sarah finally found her voice. We never meant for it to go this far. We just needed some help getting started, and we always planned to pay it back. With what? I asked. You've never held a job for more than 6 months. Sarah and Glenn's consulting business has never turned a profit. You were never planning to pay anything back. You were planning to put me in assisted living and sell my house to cover your debts. Glenn's shoulders sagged. What do you want from us? David answered for me. What Russell wants is very simple. He wants his property returned to him free and clear. He wants you to assume responsibility for all the fraudulent loans you took in his name, and he wants you to leave his house immediately. We can't afford to pay off those loans, Glenn said weakly. That's not Russell's problem anymore, David replied. You created this situation through fraud and elder abuse. The consequences are yours to bear. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised from a baby, and felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. You have 24 hours to pack your belongings and leave. The locks will be changed tomorrow evening. Dad, please, where are we supposed to go? That's not my concern anymore, Glenn. You're 41 years old. You should have figured out how to support yourself by now, instead of stealing from your father. Sarah burst into tears. This is all your fault, she screamed at me. You're a bitter old man who can't stand to see his son succeed. I looked at her calmly. No, Sarah. I'm a man who finally remembered that he deserves better than to be treated like a servant in his own home. David began packing his documents back into his briefcase. Russell, I'll file the paperwork tomorrow to reverse the fraudulent property transfer and discharge your liability for the loans Glenn took. It may take a few weeks to work through the system, but legally you're protected. After David left, Glenn and Sarah retreated upstairs to pack. I could hear them arguing, their voices carrying through the floorboards. Sarah was crying. Glenn was making phone calls, probably trying to find somewhere to stay, someone to borrow money from. I sat in my living room, in the house that was finally truly mine again, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The next evening, I watched from my window as Glenn and Sarah loaded their belongings into a moving truck. They'd managed to find a small apartment across town, probably with help from Sarah's parents. Glenn avoided looking at the house as they drove away, but Sarah glared at me through the passenger window with pure hatred. I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. Over the next few weeks, I had the locks changed just as I'd promised. I hired a lawn service to maintain the yard, not because I couldn't do it myself, but because I no longer had to prove my worth through physical labor. I updated my will, leaving everything to a scholarship fund in Margaret's name. 3 months later, Glenn called. His voice was subdued, almost humble. Dad, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I'm getting help. I found a therapist, and Sarah and I are in counseling. That's good, Glenn. I also wanted to tell you that I understand now what I did to you, how wrong it was. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry. I sat quietly for a moment, processing his words. Glenn, I appreciate that you're getting help, but an apology doesn't undo 8 years of abuse and theft. I know. I was hoping maybe someday we could try to rebuild something. Not the way it was, but something honest. Maybe, I said, but that would require you to prove that you've really changed, not just tell me you have. I understand. We talked for a few more minutes, carefully and formally, like acquaintances rather than family. When I hung up, I felt neither anger nor hope, just a quiet acceptance of what was. 6 months after that night in the living room, I was sitting on my back patio, reading the newspaper and enjoying my morning coffee, when Mrs. Patterson from next door called over the fence. Russell, how are you doing? You seem so much happier these days. I looked around at my garden, at the house where Margaret and I had built our life together, at the peaceful morning stretching ahead of me, with no demands, no humiliation, no walking on eggshells around people who should have loved me. I am happy, I told her, and realized it was true. For the first time in 8 years, I was living my own life again. I had my dignity back, my home back, my self-respect back. Glenn and Sarah had tried to erase me, to reduce me to a convenient source of money and labor. Instead, they'd given me the greatest gift possible. They'd shown me that I was strong enough to stand up for myself, even at 63, even against my own family. Some people might call what I did to them harsh, but I call it justice. They made their choices, and choices have consequences. I'd spent too many years protecting them from those consequences, and it had nearly destroyed me. Now I protect myself, and that makes all the difference in the world. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. Before saying goodbye, if this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Don't forget to subscribe for more true family betrayal stories that reminds us we are stronger than we think.